The subway train rattled and groaned as it hurtled through the underground tunnels, the dull hum of the engines drowning out the sounds of the city above. We huddled together in the dimly lit carriage, our hearts still racing from the horrors we had witnessed in the streets above. As the train barreled onward, we clung to the faint hope that we were leaving the nightmare behind us. But as the minutes turned into hours, a sense of unease settled over us like a heavy blanket, a nagging feeling that we were not out of danger yet. I glanced around at my friends, their faces drawn and pale in the dim light of the subway car. We were all on edge, the memory of the creatures that had chased us through the streets still fresh in our minds. Suddenly, a piercing shriek echoed through the tunnels, causing us to jump in alarm. It was the unmistakable sound of birds, but there was something different about it this time. Something bigger, more menacing. My heart sank as I realized what it meant. The creatures were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next opportunity to strike. And this time, they sounded even more dangerous than before. Before we could react, one of my friends, Ari, rose from his seat and made his way towards the restroom at the end of the carriage. We watched him go, our hearts pounding in our chests as we waited for him to return. But moments later, we heard his panicked voice echoing through the subway car, followed by the unmistakable sound of gunfire. Without hesitation, we rushed to his aid, bursting into the restroom to find him standing over the body of a man, his face twisted in horror. "What happened?" I demanded, my voice trembling with fear as I surveyed the scene before me. Ari shook his head, his hands trembling as he gestured towards the corpse on the floor. I found them," he stammered, his eyes wide with shock. "The creatures. They were feeding." I felt a chill run down my spine as I followed his gaze to the suitcase lying open on the floor. Inside, nestled among neatly folded clothes, was a small pistol with a silencer attached, along with several magazines of ammunition. Without a word, I reached for the weapon, my fingers trembling as I weighed it in my hands. It was a Mauler 32 ACP, a compact handgun capable of delivering lethal force in the right hands. With a silent prayer of thanks, I tucked it into my waistband and turned to face my friends. "We have a weapon now," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We have a chance." But our moment of triumph was short-lived, for as we stood there in the cramped confines of the subway car, we heard a sound that sent a chill down our spines. It was the unmistakable clinking of claws on metal, the sound of something big approaching. We exchanged terrified glances as the noise grew louder, drawing closer with each passing moment. And then, without warning, one of the doors at the far end of the carriage swung open, revealing a sight that made my blood run cold. Standing before us was a creature unlike anything we had ever seen before. It stood at least 6 feet tall, its sleek black and gray feathers ruffling in the stale air of the subway car. Its beady eyes gleamed with malice as it bared its razor-sharp teeth in a menacing snarl. But the most terrifying thing of all was the sound that came from its mouth, a twisted mockery of human speech that sent shivers down my spine. "Come out! Come out, wherever you are!" it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "I can smell your fear." We stood frozen in terror as the creature advanced towards us, its claws clicking on the metal floor with each step. But as it drew closer, I felt a surge of adrenaline course through my veins, a fierce determination to fight back against the darkness that threatened to consume us. Without hesitation, I reached for the pistol at my waist and leveled it at the creature's chest, my hand steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. With a steady breath, I squeezed the trigger and fired. The first shot went wide, missing its mark by inches and embedding itself in the wall behind the creature. But before it could react, I fired again, this time aiming for its throat. The bullet struck home with a sickening thud, sending the creature reeling backwards with a deafening roar of pain. For a moment, it teetered on the brink of collapse, its eyes wide with shock as it struggled to comprehend what had just happened. But then, with a final desperate lunge, it lunged towards us, its claws outstretched in a final, desperate bid for survival. I fired again, and this time, the bullet found its mark. With a strangled cry, the creature collapsed to the floor, its lifeblood pooling around it in a dark, viscous puddle. We stood there in stunned silence, our hearts pounding in our chests as we struggled to come to terms with what had just happened. But even as the adrenaline faded and the reality of our situation sank in, I knew that our ordeal was far from over. For out there in the darkness of the tunnels beyond, more creatures lurked, waiting for their chance to strike. And as we stood there, surrounded by death and destruction, I knew that our fight for survival was far from over. We stumbled out of the subway station, gasping for breath as we emerged into the dim light of the city streets. But what greeted us was a scene of utter devastation. Bodies lay strewn across the pavement, their lifeless eyes staring blankly into the distance as if unable to comprehend the horror that had befallen them. I felt bile rise in my throat as I took in the carnage that surrounded us, the stench of death hanging heavy in the air. It was as if the entire world had been turned upside down, the familiar streets of our city now transformed into a nightmarish landscape of blood and destruction. But amidst the chaos, there was a glimmer of hope. In the distance, I could see the flashing lights of military vehicles, their armored hulls gleaming in the pale light of the moon. Without hesitation, I motioned for my friends to follow me as we made our way towards the source of the commotion. As we drew closer, the sounds of gunfire and shouting filled the air, a cacophony of chaos that threatened to overwhelm my senses. But we pressed on, driven by a desperate need to find safety amidst the madness that surrounded us. And then, just as it seemed like we were on the verge of escape, we rounded a corner and came face to face with a sight that sent a chill down my spine. Before us stretched a line of military tanks, their turrets trained on the horizon as they rumbled towards the south of the city. But what caught my eye was not the tanks themselves, but the eerie silence that hung over the streets like a shroud. There were no sounds of battle, no shouts of triumph or cries of pain. It was as if the entire world had been swallowed up by the darkness, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. I turned to my friends, a sense of foreboding settling over me like a heavy weight. "We need to keep moving," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We can't stay here." Without waiting for a response, I set off down the street, my footsteps echoing in the silence as we made our way towards the outskirts of the city. But no matter how far we walked, the sense of unease never left us, a constant reminder of the horrors that lurked just beyond the edge of our vision. And then, just when it seemed like we were on the verge of collapse, we stumbled upon it. A small, nondescript building nestled on the outskirts of town, its windows boarded up and its doors bolted shut. With a sense of relief, we pushed open the door and stepped inside, the musty smell of decay washing over us like a wave. But despite the darkness that surrounded us, there was a sense of safety in the air, a feeling that we had finally found refuge amidst the chaos that had consumed our city. As we huddled together in the dim light of the building, I couldn't help but wonder what had become of the world outside. Were we the last survivors, destined to wander these empty streets until the end of our days? Or was there still hope, a flickering ember of humanity amidst the darkness that threatened to consume us? But as I looked around at my friends, their faces drawn and pale in the dim light, I knew that no matter what the future held, we would face it together. For in the darkness that surrounded us, we had found strength in each other, a bond that could never be broken, no matter what horrors awaited us in the days to come.